Okay, so welcome to this Four Pees Café. Subject of the day, rendering intents in color management. This is not the first cafe we have done about color management. In fact, it is the fifth session on this subject. Some of this will build on what the previous cafes have done. So in this case, we're going to look again, a small recap of color spaces, of color conversions, and then specifically the rendering intents. So previously in Four Pees Café, what have we seen? Well, the very first color management cafe was all about light. So we have our light source that has a certain amount of radiation. We have an object that reflects and absorbs certain amounts of radiation. We have our observer that is only seeing certain amounts of radiation, and all of that multiplied by each other gives you a certain color impression. And with that, we had reached how light becomes color and how people actually see color. Then in the second cafe, we took this concept and we thought about how to name colors, how to consistently communicate about colors to each other. And we could give certain colors just a name and then use that name consistently amongst each other and use that. But it is also interesting to prevent the amount of names and to make everything a little bit easier to use color spaces where certain coordinates in a stock system can give you a certain impression. And the advantage of using a system like LAB is that you can work from spectrophotometric measurements and use that information to use coordinates. Then, once we have these colors defined in LAB, we talked about how to communicate to each other, how to do conversions. So if we have a person speaking Dutch, we have a person speaking French, and we want them to communicate with each other, and both of them only speak their language and English, then we have English as a common language. And in our color management world, that means English would be our LAB system. And then the previous cafe, the most recent one that we did on color, was about expanded gamut and how having extra primaries in your color space can make colors that were not reachable before suddenly within gamuts and have them available to you in your color production system. And now we have reached the fifth session, and today we are going to talk about rendering intents. So, quick refresher on a few of the things we will need for this. We have our color-dependent color spaces on the left, and we have our independent color space, our LAB, on the right. These are different things. Most importantly, the device-dependent color spaces are the ones that where you have primaries that are stuck to a device and no two devices are alike. The device-independent color space is our LAB color space, where for everybody in the whole world, a certain LAB value means the same thing. These are spectral measurements. This is theoretical. Any color can be defined, and device-dependent color spaces like cameras, screens, and printers are unique, have their own primaries, CMYK or RGB, and are always slightly different from each other. So we have to convert between one and the other. Again, we have our Dutch and our French-speaking people. They both have a dictionary translating their language to English. So we know English is the language we can use to communicate to each other. If we put this aside and we turn this into color management, that means we have, for example, our RGB camera and our CMYK printer, and we can use our LAB color space to communicate to each other by using our color profiles, our ICC color profiles, which are basically those dictionaries. You have a table that contains a bunch of RGB values, a bunch of LAB equivalents for those values, and then anything that isn't in the table can be calculated. So the table doesn't have to contain every possible color, as long as it contains enough colors to give you the option to calculate the others. Now, this is all the easy part, right? This is where you are talking about, see, this is all you need. It's just a table of values, and anything I have on the RGB side, I can put in my table, make an LEB thing, and check the table with the LEB values for my printing side and convert them to CMYK. And there we go. We don't have any issues whatsoever. But there is a problem, and that's where rendering intents come in. Now, if I have my RGB profile, I have this big of a color space. If I have my CMYK profile, this is only that big. So a lot of the area that can be covered by RGB is not covered by CMYK, which means that any value that the LAB, that the table from RGB to LAB contains, that is somewhere in this gray area, would not be part of the table for my CMYK profile. So I can't reproduce it, so anything outside it becomes black. That would be a not very nice way of doing this. So instead, we need to learn how to handle the colors that are not possible in our output space. Typically, this is the way it goes. Typically, our input space is a really big one, and often it's RGB, because a lot of the content that people generate is based on photographic content, it's images, or in your design application on a screen, you are using an RGB color space because your screen is giving you an RGB output. So anytime people create content, they often use RGB. And our output devices using ink, when we're talking about print, of course, if your output is also an RGB color space, you might not have this issue if you're producing stuff to be displayed on screens. But if we're talking about print, our output space is typically going to use ink. That ink is going to be probably CMYK, or if you followed the previous café, you might be using expanded gamut, or you could use any primaries you want, really, to generate your output. But these primaries are probably going to be more limited in the color space than the input RGB was. So we're always decreasing our color gamut as we go through our production process. That's where the rendering intents can help us calculate the colors that we cannot reproduce. There are 4 original basic rendering intents that you probably know by name. You've seen them while working in Photoshop, in Design Illustrator, or in your RIP or wherever. It's perceptual, relative colorimetric, absolute colorimetric, and saturation. Can there be others? Yes, there can be others. More about that at the very end of this presentation. Let's go through a few of these. First of all, why are they needed? Well, we've just done that. This is our first color space, but simplified as a big circle. This is our second color space, our output space, which is a smaller circle. If we overlap these, any colors that are within both circles can be reproduced without any problems, which means you're in luck. You don't need to do anything. You don't even need a rendering intent. Rendering intent doesn't matter when all the colors that you are trying to produce are within reach of both the color spaces. This can be luck. You just might have an input file that happens not to have any colors that you can't reproduce with your output device. Or it might be intentional. This could be a design choice where the designer was asked to only use CMYK and specifically, for example, iso-coated when creating a certain product. That might be on purpose. It might also be because you are working with expanded gamuts and you have a press that can handle a very large gamut. So you might not have a lot of colors that can be reproduced. Whatever the reason, it's easy. Any color that you have in one file can be exactly reproduced in the other, in theory. So you shouldn't have much problems, and the rendering intent won't make a difference, unless you use saturation. We'll see that in a second. The first one we're going to go in detail about is the perceptual one. So in this case, you can see all the black dots. My colors are no longer within reach of both spaces. We have several colors that are outside of my green circle. So I need to move these. I can't reproduce that color where they are. I need to choose a color that I am going to represent those dots with. With perceptual, we can just do this. All the colors will move. none of them will stay completely accurate, except for white, which is in center, which hasn't moved. Even colors that were already within our gamut will have moved. So this is not a very accurate color space, but where, well, color space as in a rendering intent, this is not a very accurate conversion. But where you use this rendering intent, that accuracy might not be the most important thing. Perceptual is typically used for photographic images. It keeps relative color differences. You saw that in the circle when it scaled. The difference between two colors will stay relatively accurate. Any two colors will be different from their original colors, so less accurate, but the difference between each of the colors will be just about the same. That is a good thing because it keeps areas of the image from being clipped. This is typically an issue in the shadows or in very saturated colors, where you have colors that are basically clipped off and you lose any detail and a whole area of a file becomes one single field of color. That is when perceptual shines. In these cases with those images, the color accuracy is not often the most important thing, but the whole experience, everything you see in the image is the most important thing. When a photographer creates a photograph with specific detail in the shadows, they will want the people viewing the image to see that detail, to see that part of the image. While if you clip that part off and it becomes one black field or one colored field, you lose that content and they will not want to lose that content. Of course, typically photographic images are also reproduced in a professional context with digital devices that have a large gamut and that will be able to reproduce very bright colors. But if you produce something for, let's say, a newspaper, you're still printing photographs and you still want them to show everything that was part of the original. In a newspaper, color accuracy, again, might not be the most important thing. Okay, I have an example. I looked for an image in our Four Pees database of branded images that was going to show us something, because most of our images with our branding are relatively flat colors, are not very necessarily bright colors. There is a yellow and a pink, but they're not that saturated that they don't convert nicely to CMYK, because obviously we chose them for branding, which means we're printing these on our business cards, on our flyers, and we chose colors that are reproducible. Now, in this image, we have the advantage with the balloon that we have some nice like gradients between bright areas, and we have some stuff here. There's a lot of detail happening here in the shadows. You see this gradient happening, you see these gradients happening. And in the conversions, we're going to see what happens to these colors. That might be the more saturated one, that might be the darker ones, to see if we can spot the difference. I gave these slides a gray background, so you don't get too distracted by the flashy colored background that I have in all the other slides. This is our input file. It's in sRGB color space, it's an RGB file. I did add a filter in Photoshop to make it slightly more poppy than the original image was, but that doesn't really matter. This is the image that we put into the production profile and into the production workflow. Now I'm going to convert this image to CMYK. I've chosen ISO coated as my production standard, and I'm going to use the perceptual rendering intent. So we have our RGB file now, and this is our result in ISO coated. Now I'm going to go back and forth a few times so you can see what happens to the file. I am not very confident in how much of these differences are very visible through the Zoom call, but some places I'm going to draw your attention to. If you look here at the bottom of the P, you see now there is a fairly straight division between the yellow-greenish one side and the pinkish other side. Now let's see what happens when I go back to the RGB. Here, it's a lot smoother gradient between the two. You see here, it becomes slightly of a line. Here, it's more of a gradient. It's specifically those shadow areas where we lose that, that detail a bit, where you lose that gradient a little bit, and where these colors become more linear. You see the same thing here at the top in the RGB, This becomes slightly flatter here at the top. So those are mostly the differences. Here at the side as well, this green extends a bit more. There is less of contrast between two colors. Everything becomes slightly flatter. And that makes sense because we are losing some of the brighter elements, which means when the color space shrinks, the relative differences between the colors become smaller, which results in less contrast, which is why this image is slightly flatter than the original was. Otherwise, this image is a good representation of the original. We still see that a lot of the detail in the darker places is kind of kept. You still see here some detail, here at the side, some detail. We're not losing too much to clipping. It's all fairly okay. Then we have a different color space, and you might be surprised to see this one so early. This is the saturation color space that I mentioned at the beginning. The saturation color space is something that really isn't used a lot these days. It's very seldom used. That's because it's not accurate at all. And the advantage that it gives is not really an advantage that we seek a lot in our current print industry. It will push colors to maximize the use of the target color gamut. So colors are basically the opposite of what you saw with Perceptual, where all the colors move inwards to allow for the out of gamut colors to come back. It actually pushes all the colors outward a little bit, except of course for the out of gamut ones, which are still pushed to the edge. But the inwards ones are pushed outward a little bit, and you will see more saturated results. The reason I put this one second is because I want to talk more about the colorimetric in the second, and I figured I'd get this out of the way. So if I look at my start image, this is the same RGB start image as before, and I convert it to ISO coded using a saturation rendering intent. Our result is this. See how huge the difference is here. So it still has to move our colors within gamut. So that happens, but other than that, all the colors are pushed to be as saturated as they can be, really. Oh, that's too quick. So what we see here is this yellow is brighter here, but brightness and saturation are the same thing, right? This is actually a lighter color, which is more easy to achieve in your printing setup than this color is, where you see it uses as much yellow as it possibly can. So it's pushed outwards in the yellow a lot. We see the same thing here in the pink. It goes from the highlights, which are now white, it pushes them into the pink and into the yellow. And here these dark colors are also being pushed to more saturation, so we lose all the real dark shadows. This is what saturation does. It still might be a viable choice. Sometimes if you're looking to make colors pop to maximize the use of your output gamut, and you don't know exactly what you're looking for, you can still use saturation. Just give it a test, see what comes out. You might like it, you might be able to use it, but it's going to be a choice. It's not something that you typically use in a standardized workflow. With that out of the way, we end up with colorimetric. We have two colorimetric rendering intents. We have relative colorimetric and absolute colorimetric. Now, both do the same thing. So if I take my four colors in my two circles here, and I see what it does, it will push the colors that were out of gamut into the gamut, and it will leave everything else alone. So we have our two out of gamut colors here at the top right, which are outside the green circle. We have two colors inside the gamut. In the resulting file, those two colors will be still exactly the same. So it's a completely accurate reproduction. Any color that does not need to change will not change. The colors that are out of gamut, however, have to change, and they end up at the nearest edge, essentially, of the resulting color space. So in this case, these colors are just taken and pushed to the closest edge, the nearest reproducible color that matches them. Now, what that results in is exactly what I said Perceptual was good at. So this is better than Perceptual in keeping as many colors as accurate as they can be, because it doesn't change all the colors. It only changes those that need to be changed. But it's worse than Perceptual in where you're looking for, where you're losing that data, where you're clipping in those very dark or very saturated areas. This is, however, used most of the time when we're talking about CMYK vector artwork. Why? Because those files contain branding, for example. And if we have files that have specifically made in CMYK branded logos or colors or whatever, those colors should not be changed in a conversion. They should stay accurate. And as these things are designed to work in the output spaces, like our four-piece branding that I talked about before, if these things are meant to work in these output spaces, you don't want to change those. You don't have to change those. And this rendering intent will not move any colors that don't need to be moved. So in that sense, this is a very good color space. Now, what is the difference between this and, actually, let's look at this first and then look at the difference with absolute. So again, I have my RGB image. I have my relative colorimetric result. So you see here, the difference is a lot less, it's less of a big difference than we had in both perceptual and in saturation. This appears like a closer match. You can see less of the file changing when I flip between these two files, right? What does change, we see again, everything here in the dark side of the balloon changes. Oh, scrolling is a bit of a, there we go. Here in the shadows, here on the inside, these are the areas that change, all the dark parts. And you see the difference. They're very smooth gradients in the RGB file. They become a bit of a, there is a bit of a banding issue when you convert the file. Again, you see this smooth gradient becomes a bit clipped in the middle and becomes in two separate fields. Here at the top, we see a line has appeared, where previously it was rather smooth. We see more of a line has appeared. I see someone is asking for the slides. We can check with some can probably provide the slides when this webinar is over and when the video is also going to go on YouTube. So if you're looking for this information afterwards, we will put this recording in as high as the resolution as we're recording it basically on YouTube. So you should see the full resolution there. Zoom might be messing with the quality of the files. We'll see if we can get you the recording, and otherwise you'll definitely be able, the file itself, the PDF, otherwise you'll be able to view the recording on YouTube as well. Okay, so what do we see? We see the clipping is happening here at the edges. Everything becomes a bit more sharp between these two slides. And that's what happens. But you do see that a lot of the file, most of the file, does not change color at all. The blue background is barely touched, while in the previous two conversions, the blue background was definitely changing color. Then we have our absolute colorimetric intent. Now, like I said, it's basically the same thing as the relative colorimetric intent, but it takes into account the white point of the input profile of the conversion. Why is that important? Because specifically with proofing, you want to see what you're going to produce. So this is typically used in a second conversion, not in your first conversion, to reproduce the white point of your print substrate on your screen or on your proofing device. That is the only difference. So if you're looking at these rendering intents and you're thinking, oh, which one should I be using? 99% of the time, it's going to be relative colorimetric. The only reason to use absolute colorimetric is when you're looking at a proofing workflow. If somebody thinks I'm wrong, please get in chat. So here we have our absolute colorimetric comparison. We have our RGB input file and we have our ISO-coded output file. So if I go between these, now we see everything changes. Now, why would everything change? We're still doing a colorimetric conversion. We're still keeping as many colors as accurate as possible. Why does everything change? Why do we see the whole file popping slightly different? Well, we're working with transparent inks here, right? We're printing with transparent inks, which means our paper white has an impact on everything. The light goes through the inks, hits the paper, is reflected back, but it lost a bit of the radiation to the paper. The paper absorbed some of the light and it reflects some back. Now we're thinking of white paper, and white paper should reflect everything, but paper isn't necessarily white. Typically, it's about a 95 L value in the LAB. If you look at the ISO coated standards for coated paper, it's about 95, it's 95, like 1 -4 or -5, something like that. So it's slightly bluish and it's slightly less than white. It's slightly grayer. So this has an impact on everything. And that's why you see with absolute colorimetric, everything changes a little bit. And if I can pop between, that's why I have these links here, we can see the difference between our absolute colorimetric, our relative colorimetric, and our input file, right? So input to relative gives us most of the colors remain the same, except for those clipping that happens in the shadow. If I click on my link for absolute, and I go back between RGB and absolute, we see a lot of stuff changes. If I go between the two, we see that some of the colors here, while the image as a whole gives us the same feeling, everything changes a little bit when you go between. So that's where absolute comes into play. Now, we have one thing that we haven't mentioned yet. When looking at your conversion options in pretty much any application that offers conversion options, you'll see black point compensation as an option for the relative colorimetric rendering intent. I think Photoshop offers the option for perceptual, though it doesn't make a lot of sense there. The goal here is basically to help us with the specific problem that we have with the colorimetric rendering intent, that clipping happening in the shadows. And we know perceptual doesn't have that issue. So instead of using one or the other, we can use relative colorimetric rendering intent with black point compensation and use some of the features that perceptual offers in the areas where relative colorimetric has trouble. Thank you, Axel. Exactly. So the FOCA 39 white point is L95, A0, B -2. It depends on the paper type, because there are multiple paper types and they have their own settings. For FOCA 51, the B value is -6. So that's a bluer paper than FOCA 39 had. So depending on the paper type, there is a certain standard for how white that paper has to be. And there is a range of allowed values for a paper that wants to conform to the paper types defined by the ISO standards. All of that can be read up on in the ISO standards. If you haven't read those already, they're riveting light reading material to go through in the evening. But these values help you understand what's going on. So black point compensation can help us with preventing the weakness of the colorimetric rendering intent by adding the strength of the perceptual rendering intent. So typically, you can try leaving it on. It will make your conversion slightly less accurate. It's going to move a few colors around, but it will also help you keep that detail and prevent potential clipping in the areas where you would see it without it. That's what black point compensation does, if you had never understood that before. You see this option in pretty much any color conversion engine when you look at your conversions. Now, in my first slide, I had this other as a potential rendering intent. Now, other means, well, if you look at it, these four rendering intents I mentioned, right? We have our saturation, our perceptual, relative colorimetric, and absolute colorimetric rendering intents. These cover a lot of the use cases, right? Basically, the two methods that I showed with the animation show you two options. You have either crop everything, or crop the pieces that you can't reproduce. Or with black point compensation, do a bit of both. Now, why would you need others? Well, some vendors might have created their own rendering intents. After all, these aren't laws of nature. These are just potential solutions for a problem. And these four have been known as kind of the standards. But if you can imagine a better way, you can feel free to create a better option. If you say, okay, I like relative colorimetric with black point compensation, but I would like to push highly saturated colors slightly more to the outside where possible and include some saturation in this method. If you can make the math work, you could create your own rendering intent. Now, not everybody can simply do that, of course, which is why I'm saying vendors, the people who create these color management tools, could have done such a thing. I know, for example, if we look at the device link options in Colorimetric, there are different rendering intents, and typically they have some kind of advantage for a very specific issue, like with multicolor or things around those lines. Yeah, so they might look to solve specific problems or to create a very specific result, and that could be a very creative rendering intent. Let's see, there we go. We still have a few slides to go. I did mention the absolute colorimetric rendering intent. We're going to look at a practical proofing workflow to see if we can explain what's going on here. So there we go. We have a incoming file that has, for example, is a photograph or a designed file. It's a choice, whatever your input file would be. And we have a production tool like a printer. Now I have to convert from one to the other. So I choose either Perceptual, if it's a photograph, or relative colorimetric, if it's a brand color space. I can decide which one I would like to do. There's some stuff happening there. And I do that conversion depending on what features I feel are important in this use case. Okay, that's my normal production conversion. Now there is, of course, proofing. What does proofing do? Well, with proofing, you're trying to simulate your production output. And this could be, in my example, on a digital printing press, a proofer, or it could be on a screen. If you want to do a soft proof, you can do it on a screen. If you would print it out, it would be a hard proof. Now, what you're trying to do is reproduce how your file will look in that specific production environment. So I will do my first conversion from my input file to my production file, and then I will do a second conversion from my production color space to my proofer. And that conversion will be absolute colorimetric because I have to reproduce the color space of the substrate that I am going to print on because it does impact my output color. So it is part of what I'm trying to prove. So doing that will simulate the paper white. And I have done that with that image. I have added a small white box to the top of my image as well. So I have my RGB input file. I chose a perceptual rendering intent and converted my file to ISO coated. This is my production file. This is the file I am going to send to press. That is this file. And then I want to have a proofed file for this to know what my press will actually reproduce. And that's why I do a second conversion, absolute colorimetric, to my proof for color space. Now, this is very small. You probably, like, looking at it like this, I can't even tell if there is much of a difference between these three images. They look very similar to me, just side by side like this. So we're going to look at them in big on a gray color space. Now, having stared at that green space for too long, the gray in the background of this slide in my eyes has suddenly turned pink. Okay, so we have our RGB file. I have a digital color meter here in the corner of the screen that is looking at this white spot. And it says it's 100L 0A 0B. It's a digital file. I added a perfect white in the top corner just to see what happens. Now I do my first conversion. My resulting file is iso-coated. The white spot is still 100L 0A 0B. Why is that? Because this is the file I am sending to my printer. So the only color in this file is the color that my inks have to add to my paper. I obviously don't have to send my paper white to a machine that has the paper in it, right? I send my colors there and they get put on the paper, which adds the paper white. So in this case, my white stays white. It's not converted at all, but my file changes the colors that would change. Then I do my second conversion for my proofer, and we see again, there is a change. Now, why does this file look different than this file? Well, it's because this doesn't take into account that paper yet. In this case, we do. The paper isn't white. You can see at the top left what happened in my conversion. It became an L of about 94.8, an A of 0.33, and a B of -2.5. So it's somewhere pretty close to the standard that we chose, the iso-coated, and the values that Excel gave us, which is a 95.0 -2. It's pretty close. There is a rounding error. If I went over a few of the white pixels, the values changed. It stays an image, the bits, the individual pixels got translated slightly differently, whatever, right? It's very close to what we expect to see. Now we see the paper, and we see the paper has basically put a slightly gray filter over the entire file, which is why the proofer will give us something like this. And then we have our original file, the file we see on our screen as we send it to production, and what the actual result would look like printed in iso-coated according to our proof. And that would be a proofer workflow. Now, this file, this proofed image, is only for proofing. This is the file that is sent to production. And that is basically as far as I was going to go with these rendering intents. As always, this is a four-piece cafe. So if you want to start a discussion, if you have any questions, if you have any remarks, if you want to add something that you know that you think would be useful in this context, you can get in chat and I'll read it out, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll give it a second because, you know, if you're all furiously typing right now, we'll see some messages pop up, I'm sure. If not, then I'm going to assume that I was fairly clear in the explanation. I know that it wasn't a look into like super detail, but these cafes are meant to explain the basics. They're not meant to, like, I'm not going to put all the mathematical formulas and stuff on the screen because there's not going to be a lot of added value there. This is supposed to explain when you're looking at things, oh, I know what that means. If you haven't seen them yet, please do go check out the previous four Pees Cafés. They are very informative, and the whole aim of this session, these sessions on color, is to take something that everybody looks at with a mystified, magical, very, very difficult feeling and make it easier by at least like showing the basics, what it's for, what it does. And we do go from the start all the way to ICC profiles, as you know, and use them every day. So go check those out. This one will be added probably by Tuesday. Monday is a holiday. So probably by Tuesday, this one will be added to the YouTube channel. You can just find it with 4 Pees spelled like here on YouTube. That's where all our cafes are. We are not done. Upcoming, there is in chats, there is a thread added by Excel as well. Go check that out. I'll copy it for myself so I don't forget to give that a look, and I'll read that as well. We're not done with the cafes. There are upcoming ones. On June 16th, there is a cafe that's 2 weeks from now about decorating PDF files with HTML and looking at how PDF Toolbox and PDF Chip, both applications by Colors software, handle that. If you don't know these tools, we have a lot of videos on PDF Toolbox. PDF Chip is slightly less known, but is a really cool tool that can create PDF files from HTML input, which means you can basically do a lot of variable data stuff, a lot of auto-generated file stuff with that. That's in 2 weeks. And on June 30th, we have another Color Cafe because Zebra 10 is about to be released, or just has been released. It's either one or the other. And there is a cafe with the product manager from ColorLogic as a host who will explain all the new features, what's up, why Zebra is a really great tool. So if you already use Zebra or if you're interested in it, come join that one, and you have the option to ask questions to the ColorLogic team directly as well in that cafe. Now, other than that, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I'm really glad that these color cafes seem to be something that people are interested in. If you have any topics that you think, hey, we would really like to see this specific thing, could you talk about that? And we have someone in the 4 Pees team who could be considered an expert on a topic like that, then we would be glad to organize something for that. If you want to see some of our tools, send us a message and we can organize a one-to-one demo for specific tools as well. Feel free to reach out. I'm giving everybody another option to ask some questions. In chat or by unmuting before we shut this down. But other than that, I would like to wish everybody a great evening, a good weekend, and I hope to see everybody next time.